Hey, Tom Bartels from growfoodwell.com, and today I wanted to show you briefly one of the easiest ways to add fertility to your garden, and I'm sitting on it right here. This is just a pile of leaves that was dumped by a truck that I've asked to come here and dump leaves every year. It's a local landscaping company, and the reason I use leaves for this compost method is I used to use straw and hay and try to compost that and get that from local sources, but because of the widespread use of broad-leafed herbicides, specifically Milestone and some others, there's a lot of pesticide carryover in that material, so I tend to avoid it. But using leaves from deciduous trees tends to be a very clean source of carbon, and in this case what I've done is each year I stage different piles around the property. This one's been here about a year and a half, and when I put it in initially, I layer it and I soak it down with a hose and I inoculate it with some soil to get the bacteria going in there. And then the important thing is I add thousands of worms to this, some red wrigglers from the worm bins. And what happens over time, if you keep the pile wet, and initially that happens on its own, when you start the pile initially, but it stays wet if you just leave it out in the snow and the rain. I don't cover it, and there's enough mass so that if it does heat up and start generating some bacterial heat, the worms can migrate to their sweet spot. They like it between about 70 and 90 degrees. So if it gets over 100, they'll move away from that area, which is fine. They'll come back later as it cools down. But the point is, they break down leaves pretty readily. And what's happened here is the population of worms that I started in here has expanded and expanded. And I'm going to just pull away the top layer of leaves here to show you what I've got going on. When you mix them in and you keep the pile wet, or start it wet and make sure there's enough water into it, this is all worm castings. I probably have 30 wheelbarrow loads full of worm castings in this leaf pile alone. The beauty is I didn't have to turn compost, I didn't have to do anything, the worms did all the work. I just set it aside, forget about it, and the worms create this black gold. And if you've never used worm castings, it's a wonderful resource. It's a great soil amendment. The enzymes in here create aggregate soils. They help with your tilth in your soil. There's lots of nutrients that are broken down from the leaves and are now plant available micronutrients in the worm the worm castings. So I've done this in a couple different areas, and I start with the worm bins, of course, because they're really relevant for kitchen waste in small batches. And I use the worms in the traditional compost piles now as well. And I used them in the wood chip hot tub experiment that I did a year and a half ago, and some of you may have seen that. If you haven't, it's pretty interesting. Just Google wood chip compost hot tub, those words, and it's number 1 or 2 on that on Google. So if you can find some spaces on your property to kind of stash some leaves, layer them, soak them down, add the worms, and just leave it alone, you will have this kind of fertility. It depends on how many worms are in there to begin with. Of course, the larger the population of worms, the faster this is going to happen. They'll break down that pile a lot faster. There's lots of worms, there's lots of worm castings and casings, the eggs, so that there's another population coming behind this one. So the more you add this to your garden, it's going to really amend your soil and create better tilth, better aggregate soil, which is what you're looking for percolation and absorption of water. Here's some eggs right here. It's just a wonderful resource for your soil, and it's a super easy way to do it. So collect those leaves while people are trying to throw them away, like this landscape company pays to dump the leaves at the dump, which I just think is crazy. So I tell them to dump them all here. I get copious amounts of leaves, and then I break them down. And it's just a way to recycle that resource into something very usable for a garden. So it's a clean way to get fertility. You don't have to worry about that pesticide carryover problem. And I really would invite you to try it at any scale at your house, wherever you live, and tell me how it works for you. I'd be really curious to see how people are using this in their own gardens. That's your best tip for today. I'm Tom Bartels. Thanks for joining me on growfoodwell.com.